Alright, so in this video what we're going to do is create an HDR image, which is stands for High Dynamic Range Image, or HDRI they'll call it sometimes, so High Dynamic Range. I'm going to start it so you can see how it works, and then afterwards I'll kind of explain what it is. Okay, so first thing that you need is this. You have to take pictures. This will only really work with a still life, but the idea is that you take a picture, the same picture in the same spot, exactly the same, multiple times, okay? So for instance, there's this photo here, okay? And what you do is you take the pictures at different exposures. So you might take a picture at like a very quick exposure, and then, at 0, and then at a long exposure, okay? Now, each one of those individually would probably not look that great, right? So one would be too dark, one might be okay, the other one might be too bright, right? You need to do at least 3, but obviously you can do, I don't know, up to let's say 5 probably would be okay. I don't think you need to do any more than that. But the idea is that you would take a photo, so you can see this one here, right? So that one's not too bad. This one's a little bit too bright. This one's obviously too dark. This one's way too bright, okay? So here we have 4 pictures, okay? And they're all different exposures. So if you know how to do that, you'd want to do that on your camera. The nice thing is if you do have a DSLR camera and you can adjust the exposure, you can do it with that. Some of the phones even have that now, that they'll allow you to adjust the exposure. But a lot of these more there's a new feature. I don't know how new it is, but there's a feature in cameras, if you have an actual camera, where it actually will create an HDR setup for you. So you click the button and it will automatically take multiple exposures right in a row of a subject. Okay. Now you can see why this needs to be a still life, because they need to be basically exactly the same, all these pictures. Because what we're going to do is we're going to use those all combined to make a nicer image. All right. Yeah. So if you were to do this, if you wanted to try and do this at some point, and I imagine photography, they'll probably have you do this. What you would want to do is you want to make sure that you have your camera stable and it's not moving. So again, using a tripod or something to make sure the camera doesn't move, shift, or shake, or anything like that. It's got to be exactly the same, as well as the subject material. The subject material cannot move. So that's why you can't it has to generally be like a still life. So if you're doing, landscapes, that as long as there's not a lot of wind, or you're taking photos of a house or something, or just an object, HDRs work really well for that. All right. So once you take those pictures, you need at least 3. One underexposed, one kind of in the middle, and then one overexposed. What you do is in Photoshop, you would go to File, Automate, and then you'll see Merge to HDR Pro. You choose Files and hit Browse. And let's see, HDR. And I'm going to grab all 3 of these, or all 4 of these. All right, and then we'll hit OK. Now, the idea behind this, the reason why it's called HDR is this. When I take a photo, right, you have an aperture set and then you have exposure set. Now, if you remember, what exposure means is how long you're exposing the film or the sensor in the camera to the light, okay? So if you have a really quick shutter, right, a really quick shutter speed, then it only gets exposed for a very short period of time and you end up with a dark picture. Now, if I do a really long exposure, so imagine this is the camera. If I do a really long exposure and then shut it, it'll let a lot of light in, because the light will keep bleeding into the image, and then it'll be too bright. And then if you do it just right, it's like the Goldilocks, then it should be good. The problem is, though, even if you do the correct exposure, is that when you go to do that, it's going to be the image as a whole, right? So it might be a part that's too bright in the image, or a part that's too dark in the image, right? Now, if you expose for too long, if it was something that's too dark, that will become bright enough the way that you want it. However, the lighter areas will be blown out, right? And vice versa. So let's say you did a long exposure, or let's say you did the right way. If you exposed it long enough that, or did a really quick shutter so that something's not blown out, meaning it's not all white, right? Well, then the other area is going to be really too dark. What this allows us to do is we can take multiple exposures and then combine those together and take the nice brightness and the nice darkness and take all of those together as well as the colors that are resulting from those exposures and make an image that's actually much more, has a larger range, high dynamic range. So you'll get a more full picture and it'll be much better. Now, obviously in Photoshop, I could take that image and if something's too bright or too dark, we have ways of adjusting that, right? However, we can only superficially manipulate the pixels of whatever we took. By doing it this way, if you take if the exposure is really large or really small, it will actually expose those. You'll actually get a better image to work with, as opposed to just trying to manipulate something that's dark and trying to brighten it, because you might just end up with gray, right? Or if you have something that's too bright and you try to darken it, you're gonna end up with something that's gray and not the actual image. So this lets you work with darker versions and lighter versions and combine those together, and that's the idea behind it. So you end up getting a much more full picture. So if you are doing things where it's like product visualizations and things like that, this is a really great way to work because you get a whole variety. It also works really well for dark scenes. So like I know I had a friend and he was doing photos and he did them in a church. You know, and churches are obviously, depending on the church, but most of them are really beautiful. I grew up in as a Catholic, so obviously you go into some of those Catholic churches and they just got all this gold and awesome sculptures and the lighting's real. And your eye naturally adjusts to it, and so it looks great, but if you try to take a picture, it's always just way too dark. But if you do this, you could get kind of the darkness that you'd want, but if you could also have it overexposed and then be able to pull things out. And so it works really good for those sort of things. So if your lighting situation is kind of not that great just because it's an environment, you can kind of fix it using this as well. So it's really good for those sorts of things. Okay, so right here it shows our images, and you can see it. So it says EV, plus, 0, and minus, right? So basically the exposure values. So that's stored in the image. So I can see, okay, so that's the exposures. I don't have to do anything with those, but those are there. And what this allows me to do now is that now I can just adjust these sliders to make it look much nicer than it would have been. I don't find the edge glow that better, but the exposure and the gamma I like quite a bit. So, because for instance, if you look at this one, see how this is way blown out and this is way blown out? I can adjust my exposure, right, to brighten it up. But see how, like, this gets blown out. But instead of me superficially brightening the image, what I'm actually doing is sampling this one more. See what I'm saying? So that's actually what we're doing when I adjust this slider, is that we're using an image instead of just adding white. And we'll take the gamma down here. Actually, yeah, no, I don't want to take the gamma down. Take the exposure down a little bit. See if we can. Let's put detail up a little bit. I want to see these things here. Now this is the one I really like. So get the general. This gets kind of like the general all, and then this will allow me to adjust it. So you can see like these highlights, right, to bright. So if I take the highlight down, I can actually bring back my image there. And then if I have shadow areas that are too bright or too dark, if I want to make shadows darker, I can just go like this and it'll make them darker. Or if I go up, I can bring it back. So that's particularly useful because let's say there's like details. You can see like in here, right? I might want to be able to see these. Now by default, down here, you can't see them okay. But if this was a really dark image or something in shadow, I could pop this up and it will actually give me some of that back. But I actually kind of want to make it a little more poppy, so I'm actually going to leave the shadows kind of darker too. Vibrance will, it gives a, it kind of makes I don't want to say glow, but it kind of makes it more vibrant. I don't know. So I'm just going to up this. I like to use this one and then saturate. That will kind of do the whole, okay, it's taking a really long time. All right. And then saturation, maybe that will kind of do the overall image in a weird way. Where I feel like vibrance will pull out the bright areas. It's a little too much, I feel like. Go with that. Let's take, yeah, we're gonna leave that alone. Okay. Now there's a button here to remove ghosts. So the idea here is, remember I said you have to keep the camera exactly the same? If for some reason the image is slightly off from the other one, it will try to fix that. So that's particularly useful for like something like this, although this photo is actually pretty good. There's not really any ghosting, but if there was a little bit of wind, the branches might be in a slightly different spot from one to the other. This would try to fix that. And then I would just hit OK. And then it's going to create a new HDR image. And what it... but the idea here is just, like I said, instead of superficially trying to brighten or darken or saturate or whatever on one image, we're actually just sampling multiple images. And so you get a more full picture. And that's why it's called high dynamic range. And so you'll end up with a better result. So that's what this thing is here. So you can see this is what it looks like. So this was probably the best of my group, I would say, was this one. This one's a little bit too bright. That one's way too dark. That one's obviously way too bright. And then this guy is a little bit more controlled. Okay, so I highly suggest using this. Like if you're a photographer, I would learn this as a skill, depending on the type of photography you plan on doing. But this is definitely useful. And I would look online. You can probably find people who go more in depth with it. I'm kind of covering a bunch of things here. So, and like I said, if you end up going into photography, they'll probably cover this even more. All right. But that's HDR.